sexuality, Professor Hammonds argued that rather than assuming that Black female sexualities are structured along an axis of normal and perverse paralleling that of white women, we might find that for Black women a different geometry operates. Professor Hammonds was trained in physics and the history of science, and she wasn't just using this notion of geometry as a metaphor. Instead, she was part of a growing tradition of Black feminists who had been pushing it implicitly and explicitly for a different geometry as a measure of the matter of Black life. Professor Hammonds took her inspiration from Michelle Wallace, whose book, Black Macho and the Myth of the Superwoman, is a book you may know, but you may be less familiar with Professor Wallace's 1990 book, Invisibility Blues, in which she argued that the phenomena of the black hole might be an apt metaphor for Black feminist creativity. Professor Wallace argued the black hole represents the dense accumulation without explanation or inventory of Black feminist creativity, prevented from assuming a commensurate role in critical theory and the production of knowledge by a combination of external and internal pressures, economic and psychological. It is confined to the aesthetic and commercial. Now, we are in a different moment where there has been an explosion of new works in Black feminist critical theory, particularly for the last couple of decades. And in the ensuing years, that explosion means that Wallace's pronouncement of the problem that she named is being addressed, has been addressed by many of our academic colleagues and our colleagues beyond the academy. And in fact, I would say that we've come so far in the production of Black feminist critical theory that we might be at a different set of problems. Patricia Hill Collins, who's one of the progenitors of the field, notes that the seduction of academic recognition can mute the critical potential of feminist criticism. But I'm not actually interested in that conversation today about Black feminist theory production. This work, the book that it's going to be a part of and that I'm working through here, tries to be in the tradition of Black feminist theory production. And so I'm not even invested in a debate about the aesthetic and commercial, as Michelle Wallace called it. But I am interested in the continued use of notions of physics and geometry to inform a Black feminist account of world-making theory production and power. And for those of you in the room who are like, I'm not good at math, why is she talking about physics and geometry? I promise that I'm gonna make it come together, okay? I know it's late in the day. I wouldn't set you up for failure, okay? Nor would I set myself up. So it could be said, and I'm saying, that drawing upon the geometric is a fundamental Black feminist epistemological sensibility. And by epistemology, I mean the way in which we in Black feminist thought, in Black critical study, evaluate what we think are truth claims, right? How do you know that the things that are true are actually true? This is a field that I work in and think a lot about. So think of all the ways, for instance, that Black women and girls undertake complex geometries in their everyday lives. Prior generations quilted, sewed, crocheted. I crocheted this, and I'm going to talk more about it later. They made things. Current generations of Black women's girls and femmes are still hair obsessed. One day, while I was sitting in the hair salon, I watched my stylist, the lead stylist, teaching all the other stylists better techniques for cutting hair. It's just geometry, she told them. And when I began thinking about this work, I went back to her with questions. Can you say more about what you meant when you said cutting hair is just geometry? I asked my stylist this just a month ago. And she said, well, I'm not very good at math. Whenever we start using letters to describe numbers, I get confused. But when it comes to cutting hair, it's just lines and angles. So I nodded, starting to understand what she meant. And then she says, now the head is a sphere. So it's not just like cutting lines and angles on a flat piece of paper. Sometimes that confuses people. But yeah, it's just lines and angles. This did not sound to me like a person who did not understand geometry. Instead, she very casually offered an understanding about how the shape of the plane on which one is working, flat as opposed to curved, might change one's relationship to lines and angles. And in fact, she moved seamlessly between two different kinds of geometry just in her explanation. And yet she told me that she didn't understand it. Now, that is a common refrain, particularly among your kind of very text-based literary academics. Oh, I'm not good at math. That's why I'm like an English professor or whatever, right? Or a historian, right? But I wouldn't have paid that much attention, except that what prompted me to ask the question again was that I had a similar encounter with a woman named O. So my stylist, I'm calling M. My O is the sister that teaches crochet and craft sessions at a local Black woman-owned crafting boutique here in central New Jersey that she co-owns with her best friend. So I took up crochet last year, January of 2024, nearly 1 year to the day that my mother passed away in 2023. I don't take up new hobbies often, but when I do, I become obsessed with them like other people become obsessed with new lovers. And in the course of my crafting journey, I came upon this crafting space owned by two Black women best friends here in the middle of New Jersey, and I knew that I'd hit Black feminist world-making goals. Because at the end of the world, isn't it conceivable that one thing Black women might be doing is sitting around in a beautiful space making earrings and talking about life with their homegirls on a Wednesday evening? Well, maybe. Now, I haven't actually made the earrings at the crafting boutique yet, and so in fact, what I have done there is the first thing, I dragged my friend Joan, who also works at Rutgers, to a session to learn how to make AI images of Black life in a program called Meaure, because as O's bestie M, who teaches that workshop, told the class, well, maybe you need an extra $300 a month to make your ends meet, and you figure out how to prompt the AI, and then you use your unique images which you own to sell on coffee mugs or other merch, or instead, you simply sell the images. Either way, it's money in your pocket. And I wanted to learn about this new technology because you can generate beautiful images in Midjourney, although the fingers and toes are never quite right. But I also wanted to learn about it in a community of non-academic Black folks because my colleagues around here sort of talking about AI, freaking out about AI, and I wanted to know what regular, everyday Black folks thought about what they could use AI to do. So I thought, well, let me take a class and figure out and also learn a skill. So anyway, I'm at the crafting boutique, and we're going to go back to my crochet teacher, O. So the first crochet course that I took with O was one to learn how to make a hexagon cardigan. I made this cardigan. So what you do is you crochet two hexagons, and then you fold them along a particular axis, and then you seam them together. And I was fascinated by the idea that you could literally make two hexagons with yarn at scale, and then sew them together, and they would become a sweater. And I had learned from O how to make a granny square, which requires you to learn the math of like a circular center into 4 straight sides. But it wasn't until O casually explained, as I was literally running out the front door of the boutique to my car, that I just needed to add 2 sets of stitches to the 4 sets I already had, and that would make my 4-sided thing become a 6-sided thing. Now, I had not figured, even though I knew what a square and a hexagon was from geometry class, I had not figured out that I just needed, to go from 4 to 6 in this thing. So I've been like reading it on a piece of paper. But she was like, no, you just do this and this and this. So color me surprised when a few months later, I'm watching O teach me how to do this crochet cardigan. And she says, oh, I'm not very good at math. When the numbers turn to letters, I get confused. Now, M is a colorist for the ages, and O crochets beautiful pieces which she often sells, and she freehands them and rarely follows a pattern. Meanwhile, I have a pattern library because I am afraid to go off of it. Like, me and the pattern are bound together. So both of these acts that these women are engaged in require these complex geometries, and yet when they narrate the stories to me, they disavow geometric knowledge while performing its complex operations and calculations seamlessly. These women evince a kind of intuitive facility with the geometric while disavowing any analytic or theoretical understanding of that. And so it occurred to me that the first way to measure the shape and sound and space of a Black world is to listen to Black women. More specifically, we have to listen to what Black women say they know, or what they say they can't know, or don't know, or will never know. And we also can listen to what they say ain't their business, or what ain't worth knowing, but that's a conversation for another day. We have to listen as well to what they say confuses them. And then knowing what we know about the dominating impulses of imperial knowledge projects, we might see in the confusion of Black women not a deficiency, but an opportunity for a question. So for my part, I saw an epistemology problem. Because listen, here you have 2 Black women who don't know each other, who've never had occasion to interact, telling me all about how they don't understand geometry, very specifically. They're telling me that they don't know something that clearly they know, right? And since doing is a form of knowing, and they're also teaching other people how to do it, and they're doing it in these proper terms. So, in fact, the ability to do it and teach it might be a more valuable and essential form of knowing than merely being able to analyze. So, for me, whatever world measure requires us to disavow our knowing is a problem. It's a knowledge problem, and I wondered if perhaps the Black girls weren't the problem, but the geometry was the problem, right? So if we break the word down, geometry down into its component parts, it's literally what it sounds like. Geo is world, meter is either measure or method. So I kept trying to understand, like, what kind of intuitive geometry are these, how is it that they get it? Because I am not intuitively geometric at all. I don't do my hair, that's why I go to the salon, right? And I have to take classes to learn how to do stuff that they just seem to get up and do, right? So a search for an understanding of intuitive geometry led me by hook and by crook, and crocheters call themselves hookers because we use hooks. It's our way of being very spicy. So this exploration led me deep into a multiple centuries long epistemological debate between geometers or practitioners of geometry about the proper way to prove that geometric principles are sound. So for hundreds of years, the only acceptable understanding of geometry was that proffered and theorized by Euclid, which, a philosopher from like the 6th century. And Euclid's geometry focused on lines and angles in a two-dimensional plane. So think squares, straight lines, parallel lines, perpendicular, high school geometry. For centuries, no other geometry was thought to exist, even though artists sensed that there were more kinds of shapes in the world than lines, angles, and spheres. I don't have time to go into all the ins and outs of the epistemological debates about the nature of geometry, but there are a couple of observations that are relevant. Generations of white male thinkers from Descartes to Kant to Thomas Jefferson and Abraham Lincoln have been obsessed with Euclid and his musings on geometry. Lincoln was enamored of the way that Euclid used theorems and proofs to logically prove a point. And in fact, Euclidean argumentation and notions of evidence influence all these thinkers. So when we think about like writing things and we're like, I need a thesis and then a set of proofs, it's a Euclidean form, right? So Thomas Jefferson weaponized Euclid as proof that black people were inferior. In Notes on the State of Virginia, he wrote, comparing them, black people, by their faculties of memory, reason, and imagination, it appears to me that in memory they are equal to the whites. In reason, much inferior, as I think one could scarcely be found capable of tracing and comprehending the investigations of Euclid. And that in imagination, as if they are dull, tasteless, and anomalous. Really? Okay. Again, Euclidean geometry was focused primarily on flat planes, lines, and angles. And in its earliest phases, it didn't even really consider circles or spheres or curves. So the science writer Margaret Wertheim, who writes these popular best-selling lay histories of physics, has helped me to make sense of this as a person with only a college-level understanding of mathematics. And she says there are 3 branches of geometry: Euclidean, straight lines and angles; spherical, circles and spheres; and hyperbolic. So when I'm going to explain hyperbolic in a minute. So when Evelyn Hammonds argued that we could not understand black female sexuality in terms of an innate parallelism with white female sexuality, she was moving us out of the realm of Euclidean geometry in search of these other better geometries. And I want to talk about what that might look like. But before I get to that, and what black feminism has to say about it, I want to talk about this other Euclidean fanboy. And in the academy, we talk about him. His name is Descartes. You might know him. He said, I think, therefore I am. He was wrong. So, 1619 poem. When my crochet teacher and my beautician both proclaimed that it was the switch from numbers to letters that confounded them about geometry, I knew that switch was messing with their intuitive understanding of geometry. But I didn't realize that the choice to describe geometric principles in letters itself had a history. It is Rene Descartes, Mr. I think, therefore I am, who, using Euclid, came to believe that geometric ideas should be described in algebraic terms. Like the clearest example of that is like if you draw, if you learn how to graph on a sheet of graphing paper and you draw your x-axis and your y-axis or whatever, and in physics a z-axis. And at the mention of Descartes' name, I knew that he was the source of the problem because he's always the source of the problem. So consider this apparently off-cited origin story in Western letters about Descartes and how he came to arrive at the supremacy of geometry for making sense of the world. So it begins. On November 10th, 1619, Rene Descartes, a 23-year-old, had a series of nightmares during a fitful night of sleep. Awakened from slumber, he felt he had received the supernatural insight that, quote, mathematics was the sole key needed to unlock the secrets of nature. He undertook to prove this supposition in the now infamous text Discourse on Method, in which he also famously declared, I think, therefore I am. Not 1619 again. Susan Bordeaux notes that Descartes' resolute and positive interpretation has become a standard textbook anecdote and a symbol of the 17th century rationalist project. Bordeaux says that Descartes' Cartesian anxiety and need for mathematics to essentially dominate nature was rooted in a desire to move away from the world of the mystical, magical, and scary world of witches, spirits, dreams, and nightmare, the world of feminine and femme knowledge production, to the rationalist project of certainty. She goes on to say that his separation of the knower from the known, which modern philosophy came to regard as a given, was not actually a given, but was for Descartes a project and a foundation to be discovered. Crucial to that project was the Cartesian refashioning of the ontological orders of the human and the natural into two distinct substances, the spiritual and the corporeal, that share no qualities other than being created, permit of interaction, but no merging, and indeed are each defined precisely in opposition to the other. The body, she tells us, as we have seen, is, quote, the chief impediment to human objectivity for Descartes. Separating body from mind, quote, made possible the conceptualization of complete intellectual transcendence of the body, and in Bordeaux's estimation, this Cartesian reconstruction of the world is a defiant gesture of independence from the female cosmos. So for my grad students in the room who love Sylvia Wynter, one hears in the Cartesian refashioning of the ontological orders of the human and the natural the early echoes of what Sylvia Wynter will come to term man one and man two. But for all of us regular folks, what you hear is a person who does not believe that mind, body, and spirit are connected. And so he has all this power to tell us that, like, you know, nah, I just have intellect out here, but I don't have it within a body. And anyone who thinks with their body is a lesser order of the human, right? And so then when Black women have to have conversations about mind, body, spirit, we are literally having to heal a cleavage that this particular man enacted, right? So when Hammonds called for a new geometry, one not content with Euclidean or Cartesian assumptions, she was not merely being metaphoric. She was striking right at the heart of the Western theory project, which turned on an articulation of geometry that is anti-femme, anti-embodied, that is an anti-femme, anti-embodied measure of worlds, and that given the intellectual, administrative, and political afterlives of Euclid in the American project is also clearly anti-Black. And in fact, Hammonds ultimately concludes that, quote, reclaiming the body as well as subjectivity is a process that Black feminist theorists in the academy must go through themselves while they are doing the work of producing theory. Black feminist theorists are themselves engaged in a process of fighting to reclaim the body, the maimed, immoral Black female body, which can be and still is used by others to discredit them as producers of knowledge and speaking subjects. And we all know that the minute our bodies walk into a space, we are seen as less credible producers of knowledge. We have to justify what we mean, what we say, and then we're taught to be at odds with our own embodiment in these spaces, right? And so it has been a Black feminist theory project for more than 4 decades at this point to hit back at Descartes, and yet somehow Black girls just hanging out in their everyday lives at the hair salon and the crafting boutique still have very Cartesian ideas about the things that they think that they know. So the Cartesian anxiety and dualism that had tried to anchor this tortured mind-body split as a foundational principle of Western reason traveled through the vehicle of Euclidean geometry, which Descartes created an entirely new system for. And it is that epistemological system that produces alienation for everyday Black girl geometricians who believe that the embodied intuitive knowledge of geometry they possess does not count as an understanding of math. And as scholars, it is from this particular academic reproduction and insistence on alienation from mind and body that we need to heal. Black feminist physicist Professor Shonda Prescott Weinstein writes in her book, The Disordered Cosmos, A Journey into Dark Matter, Space-Time, and Dreams Deferred, that, quote, almost everything in my education about space eventually came back to, oh, wait, okay, I'm going to show you that picture in just a minute. Hold on, I'm going to read that. I was doing this quickly. Go back. Yeah, we'll stay right there. So she says, almost everything in my education about space eventually came back to Euclidean geometry because it was supposedly intuitive. But Euclidean geometry essentially approaches space as flat. And Euclid's foundational axioms fall apart when, as Prescott Weinstein notes, the Euclidean geometric rules don't apply on the surface of the earth, which is curved and only seems flat at short distances. But I learned this same idea from the black girl mathematician that colors my hair while explaining all the ways she didn't understand math. Prescott Weinstein makes clear that there are other global approaches to geometry, including, for instance, those of the Palapur people of the Amazon who see the world not in Euclidean flat terms, but as curvilinear. The continued insistence, even in scientific education, on teaching geometry and its related discipline, physics, in Euclidean terms, proved a challenge even for this black woman who's an astrophysicist. She said, quote, "I had been convinced that I wasn't smart enough to do the kind of science that required expertise in relativity, because while introductory Euclidean geometry felt completely counterintuitive for me, advanced general relativity felt like the most natural thing in the world." So you got the hairdresser, you got the crochet teacher, and you got the physicist, and all of them think that they're not good at geometry, and therefore that they can't do their jobs. The black feminists call for a different geometry, one that accounts for the fact that the world isn't flat and that our minds do not exist outside of our bodies, is foundational to our own knowledge production and understanding of the world. To allow for and indeed pursue a different geometry is to create the condition for a different mode of ordering both body-minds, which is how disability studies folks refer to the body, not as body and mind separately, and space-time, as astrophysicists call it. The minute that you start asking different questions about how space is ordered, you necessarily start asking different questions also about time. So to heal from the alienating, self-abnegating pronouncements of Cartesian dualism is to say with confidence that body-minds, which we all are, measure and understand black worlds in a system of space-time. Back to crochet. So one of the earliest crochet projects I made was a ruffle hat. This ruffle hat for my niece. And as soon as I decided to take up crochet as a hobby, I looked online to find all the groups and projects that black girl hookers were into. As with most things, our version of making had some aesthetic proclivities, and one of the many black girls who crochet Facebook groups I joined, I was surrounded by black girls making ruffle hats and hexagon cardigans, which are very different from the white girl groups, right? The aesthetics are different, the colors are different, the style is different, the interests are different. You can just do a little Google and you can see it. So a crochet ruffle hat, if you go to look up ruffle hat, you'll mostly see black girls doing this. A crochet ruffle hat is a series of simple increases. So after first round of stitches, in each subsequent round, you put, so if I made one stitch this round, the next round, I put 2 stitches in every round of it. This is also made that way. In every round of this, I increase the number of stitches. That's how you get that body, right, that flows. So to make this series of big boisterous ruffles, you have to add a lot of new stitches in every round. And then you get these very pronounced ruffles. And it seems to fit a black girl style aesthetic. So in the course of trying to learn more about the geometry inherent in crochet, I learned that these ruffle hats that black girls love are a form of the third kind of geometry. So if Euclidean geometry is concerned with lines and shapes with zero curvature, i.e. flat and straight, spherical geometry is concerned with geometry of spheres or circular objects, or what they call positive curvature, hyperbolic geometry is concerned with shapes that exhibit constant negative curvature. It's literally called hyperbolic, like black girls, right? The crochet forms that black girls love are hyperbolic geometric forms because of course they are, right? Our lives are lived in a hyperbolic plane in which we navigate positive and negative curvature. And while Euclid believed and insisted that the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line, black girls tend toward a truth articulated by Mae West: a curve is the loveliest distance between 2 points. The intuitive geometries that black women and girls, whether the salon stylist, the local craft artisan and teacher, or the vaunted and rarefied black feminist physics professor gravitate toward, are decidedly not Euclidean. But it is interesting that some of the earliest articulations of an explicit epistemology for black feminist thought also tended toward geometric metaphors. Is not Kim Crenshaw's intersection a Euclidean plane, right? If you don't imagine it as a traffic stop, you imagine it as like an XYZ axis, right? Like literally the intersection of race, gender, class, primarily. Patricia Hill Collins' Matrix of Domination conjures an interesting kind of power grid imagery unless you think of it as the Matrix. But, acting on Black life in service of a range of systems of power. Now, I'm still trying to figure out in this work whether I think that the Euclidean nature of Crenshaw's intersectional metaphor is, inherently brilliant because it shows that Black women's lives cannot be captured in the intersection, right? That this is the point, that power tries to act on us in Euclidean ways and we're not Euclidean people, or if the metaphor itself is itself limited because it uses a Euclidean frame to try to explain peoples and experiences that are not Euclidean. I haven't decided. So I just put both possibilities here and we'll just let them live, right? So also though, the Combahee River Collective, or Combahee, depending on who you ask, might have taken a gander around the geometric curve too when they described Black women's oppression as manifold and simultaneous. Now, while it may be tempting to consider the dictionary definition of manifold as many and various, it could be an interesting thought experiment to think about the term manifold in the sense in which a mathematician or physicist means it, because it was a love of manifolds, which Prescott Weinstein describes as a, quote, space that close in looks Euclidean, but when you zoom out may look very curved, that made Prescott Weinstein begin to trust that perhaps she was smart enough to do the kind of science required to become a physicist. I loved me some manifolds, I did, she says. And for instance, if we think of Black women's oppression as manifolds, as a set of conditions that seem to follow Euclidean logics until you either change your point of view or until the systems themselves stretch out in a different way, revealing their curves, that might in fact make better sense of what we are talking about when we speak of an intersection. So maybe it looks Euclidean, but it's actually manifold. And it turns out that all of that is right there in the tradition. That Black feminists keep on returning to a push on the geometric metaphor to articulate Black feminist experience. So Black feminist geometry of necessity is not particularly Euclidean, and it doesn't have to be, and that is because the worlds that Black girls inhabit are not Euclidean, and we know it, no matter what we learned in high school geometry class. And so Prescott Weinstein says, being able to get up close and personal with a black hole's event horizon may give us clues to quantum gravity, because it turns out that black holes are great laboratories for thinking about the intersection of quantum mechanics and space-time. So that means that Black women continue to gravitate towards a world where black holes exist, and black holes exist in a world of spherical and hyperbolic geometry, right? Space-time, the black hole, the ruffle hat, all of them are curved. As Prescott Weinstein takes care to note, space-time is not straight. So to attend to the geometric in Black feminist thought and to articulate the curves, the planes, the space-time phenomena that shape Black lives and Black and Indigenous ways of knowing is and should be an epistemological imperative for those of us who do this kind of work. It should be a healing imperative. Euclidean and Cartesian articulations of space, time, mind, and body have been deployed for explicitly anti-Black and anti-fem aims and have been weaponized against Black knowing and Black people as knowers and articulators of their own experience. It has created a world where Black women are taught not to trust their own intuitive sensibilities about the world and to disavow knowledge that they clearly possess, precisely because they have been taught that if their conceptions of space-time don't fit the mathematical presuppositions and calculations of a 23-year-old white man anxious about a changing world in the year 1619, then they must not know what they know. The imperial projections and designs of the year 1619 did not begin or end at Jamestown, and its epistemological aims, its ungendering impulses, its desire to cleave flesh from body and body from mind, its articulation of the middle passage as mere linear historical progression. All of these are forms of epistemic violence that must be contested, resisted, and reimagined at every turn. So let me tell y'all a fun way that I'm thinking about them, thinking about reimagining them. I think I skipped something, but I wanted you to hear this other Black girl astrophysicist that I just discovered, basically explaining how physicists think about time as the fourth dimension of space, right? So we think space and time separately, but based on an Einstein proclivity, they think space-time together. So I thought I was just doing a fun project about crochet and geometry, but since I have had a book deal to write a book on time for many years, I now realize that this is like basically all my little crafty stuff being like, no, you think you're talking about space. Black girls think they're talking about space. They're always talking about dimensions of time, right? So I wanted to also show y'all, this is what manifolds look like. So people crochet the coral reef because crochet is one of the easiest means for showing hyperbolic planes in real time. And so there's like a science writer who I quote from earlier who has a whole project where all around the world every year people take up, they crochet different representations of the coral reef. But isn't that representation on the end, doesn't it just look like these ruffle hats? So when I saw those ruffle hats and then I saw this, I was like, not black girls just crochet in space time in all these interesting ways and never knowing it and never having the language for it, right? Yeah. Because these are hyperbolic planes. And literally, there's a writer at Columbia who built a career by showing that crochet was the best way to represent a hyperbolic plane. You can't draw them, you can't really build them, it doesn't really work. You need a different malleable model, and this is the model. All right, so of course y'all know how to do it. If you don't, you know how to do it. So this is where I want to sort of run. So I won't try to play the video because I don't know how the internet is working in here. But I'm a Glorilla fan and a Lotto fan. And so when I heard what's the procedure when a bad bitch walks in the room, what I heard was them asking for an algorithm. I didn't say that in this crochet journey, before I took up crocheting, I spent about 6 months learning how to code. I'm not very good at it, but I did try to learn. So part of the brilliance of thinking about Black women's making practices, whether the adornment of hair or of a crochet ruffle hat or a quilt or a loom, is that this moves Black girl, femme, and feminist geometries out of the realm of the metaphorical into the real material world, or what Patricia Williams might call the matterphorical world. How we physically move our body minds through space-time is not just a matter of theoretical concern, and in fact it has often been histories of theory that have placed us at odds with the everyday brilliance of our approaches. So in the course of doing this research, I learned that crochet, knitting, and weaving, the fiber and textile arts, are being used in a range of design applications in the physical world. And I learned that much of that work turns on the idea of algorithmic crafting or stitching. And it's deeply enmeshed with the history of jacquard looms and early computing, which is to say that basically, those looms that people weave on, they were the prototypes for computers, for those who might not know. And so I learned that crochet is one of the easiest mediums to produce physical representations of hyperbolic planes. And what that means for us is that there's a counter history of algorithmic and computational thinking that exists not just among women artisans more generally, but among Black girls who have figured out, without ever knowing the equation for it, that the algorithmic equation for making a ruffle hat is n+1. So an algorithm is just a procedure for solving a problem. And the reason I'm talking about this is because all of us are always like, the algorithm got me. I've been sucked in on TikTok. I'm being fed information. We're in a disinformation crisis. So what happens if we see ourselves as fundamentally algorithmic in our own approaches, and we tell that history not as a history of the digital or the computational, but as a history of Black girls doing hair and doing handicrafts, right? So in this song, when Glorilla asked, what is the procedure when a bad bitch walk in the room? I thought the first question is, what kind of problem is this? This is what you would ask in computational thinking.
Trump promised to bring down prices, but all we got is
why is he doing that? No, we don't want to do that. I'll listen to the song later, because absolutely. So what kind of a problem is it, right? Well, so I told y'all that I learned to code a little bit. So I coded a little very basic program for y'all, and I just took a screenshot of it. And it is literally just me asking the computer, like, what do you do? What is the procedure if a bad bitch walk in the room? And so basically, if you give her the world, the sun, and the moon, that is what she told. That's what she said she wanted, right? Yes, correct. So I'm going to do a more complicated version of this program where it is like conditional, but I just wanted to sort of play around with what kinds of questions we might, like, look, part of the problem with our relation to AI is that frankly, our white counterparts have a very unimaginative set of ideas about what kinds of problems computers are supposed to solve for us. So I think that one way to mess with them in an unserious way is to say, well, what kind of problem is it when a bad bitch walk in the room? The answer is, it's a whole problem. That's the Black answer. The end. So I wonder then, I said homegirl algorithm, so I know you're like, what does that even mean? Okay, so I wonder if we might articulate not homo economicus, or even what Imani Perry terms entrepreneurial man and entrepreneurial woman, which is she's talking about the ways we've been the genres of our humanity produced under conditions of neoliberalism. Or what Margaret Wertheim, the physicist writer, terms mathematical man or mathematical woman, which was this idea that, like, basically all the men thought only they could do geometry and women couldn't learn math or do it, right? But what would happen if we articulated homegirl algorithms as an alternative account of knowers, knowledge production, data and mathematics, pleasure, power, and the self in the age of algorithms? It seems like the anxiety of this age is an algorithmic anxiety that threatens to reproduce the Cartesian split, to try to create a disembodied or avatar self that exists in the digital world that seems at continual odds with the flesh and blood self of the real world. And this algorithmic splitting is entirely, at least moderately, avoidable if we commandeer the history of the algorithmic self and locate its telling in the bodies of some of its most unlikely subjects, Black women and girls who've always been in tune with their algorithms. So Barbara Smith, we actually have Black feminism to thank for the term homegirls. Barbara Smith articulates this in this quote, which I will not read, but the Black girl joyously making ruffle hats, remixing hexagon cardigans, and hacking and hawking crochet patterns is being algorithmic and geometric in sensibility. She is just one example of Black girl geometric. Other scholars like Andrea Rose Clark, Matrice Gaskins, and Catherine Knight still all point to the ways that hair braiding in Black culture is also rooted in this notion of the algorithmic. So to consider the figure of homegirl algorithmus is to pursue an alternative and unapologetically Black feminist history of the geometric and the computational, of space-time and body minds, of data and algorithms. It is to put Black femme world making of every type at the center of our accounts of the digital. It is to return us to the quilt, to yarn, to spindle and spinning wheel, to loom, to warp and weft, to the cotton field. This takes us to the block and to the curb and not just the public square. It takes us to the bottom and the country and the barrio, to the kitchen and the porch and the vestibule, to all the places where Black girls are braiding hair and weaving yarn and spinning yarns about Black life. If you think Black girls aren't being explicitly algorithmic, let me give you one more dispatch as I end. I went to see a Black girl dermatologist about a skin problem last week, and as we were discussing solutions, the doctor said casually, with no knowledge of this project or the things I'm working on, well, after we rule out this set of things and this other set of things, then we're gonna figure out a combination of approaches to algorithmically solve your problem. I was like, wait a minute. So then I called my homegirl and I said, first of all, I was like, the doctor said the thing, and I feel like I'm being trolled by my ancestors because everywhere I go, they keep screaming at me. You know, because how does a girl that's like a Black feminist theorist end up over here talking about crochet and, you know what I mean? It's weird. And my homegirl said, not the doctor being in on it. And I was like, that's right, because Black girls are always in on it, you know? So homegirl algorithms intuitively resist Cartesian bifurcation, knows that it feels wrong to describe the world in Euclidean terms, knows that the witches and seers knew something about math and planes and the universe too. Homegirl algorithms is a path back to the witches, a path Imani Perry invites us to walk. I want to reject, Perry says, the Cartesian anxiety regarding the gap between minds and bodies, because the witches are not simply about stagnation, but about witnessing something unseen and yet seen, haunting yet deeply felt. She goes on to say, the witnessing of alternative grammars for the moral universes in the act of creativity, in art or witchcraft, is an invitation to think in different ways. To reject Cartesian dualism, this is me now, to repair the catastrophizing that Descartes' anxiety conjured, is to run towards, not away from the witches, the ghosts, the intuitive understandings of the shape and speed of space-time. The witches are engaged in doings that are challenging, says Perry. They are presenting ideas and orders that threaten to open up the dominant logic, shift the terrain of what is regarded as mattering. To listen to the witches is to recognize that Euclid, Newton, Descartes had clear perspectival limits in their understanding of the universe. We all do. The difference is that Black feminists both know it and are willing to admit it. Thank you.
Thank you.